CBSE Board, Class 11. History, Chapter 1, Part 1, Audio by Renee Matthew. Welcome to the first audio for Class 11 from the book prescribed by NCERT. The title of the book is Themes in World History. Early Societies from the Beginning of Time, Writing and City Life. As you can see on the slide, we're going to cover two themes in this particular chapter. And let's take a look at that. Come along. The first part is we're going to see the development of the early societies. Have you ever thought about the evolution of human beings? From where did they come? Nowadays, human beings are so sophisticated, they're complicated. And the technological advancement is having a great impact on the human beings. But have you ever thought of how the development took place? And how the early humans were? How did they live? The first section of this particular chapter describes about the beginnings of human existence. And sitting and listening to this particular chapter in this century is going to be really interesting. Even I felt it interesting when I started reading it. So we're going to give you some slides and information from the remote past, something which happened millions of years ago. The first humans emerged in Africa, and archaeologists took a lot of time to understand the different phases of history from the remains of bones, vessels, stone tools, and all these things were dug from the underground. There are a lot of interesting documentaries that you can find in the internet which gives pictures of what happened. Most of the pictures are included in this presentation also. Archaeologists, they dug up everything. They dug up so many remains and all these things. And they create an attempt to reconstruct the lives of early people. Because just by digging up a tool or just by digging up a bone, they will not be able to understand the whole process of evolution. They will have to recreate the way in which the human beings lived. It is a whole process. You may not understand this point right now, but you will understand by the end of this chapter. They tried to find out the shelter in which they lived, the food that they ate by gathering plants and animals, the way they express themselves. So when they take a dig at all these things, all these factors, they're able to reconstruct the society of life. And other important factors are fire and language. Then of course, finally, the lives of people. To understand the past is very important. It is very important to understand the past in order to understand the present. The second theme is the earliest cities, the development of the early cities. And one of the earliest civilization which helps us to understand the development of human being is Mesopotamia. It is very famous. It is a present-day Iraq. And there were a lot of temples surrounding this particular city, and it was a great center for long-distance trade. And this is a civilization or a place which has got lot of archaeological evidence, abundance of written material. Everything is found in this particular city. And it helps the archaeologists to reconstruct the lives of different people who lived there. For example, the normal people like the craftsmen, scribes, laborers, priests, kings, and even the high-class people, aristocratic people, queen, kings, and everybody. It helps to reconstruct the life simply. So these are the two themes which is covered in this particular chapter. Then you have an access to the pastoral people. Pastoral people played a very important role in the towns and cities. So an important thing that you have to consider is there are a lot of activities which has been happening from the time human beings were found on the face of the earth. Human beings lived or they started living millions of years ago. We don't know when they came about, the first man, right? But there is a question that you have to think about. Suppose writing was not developed. Will you be able to read about all these things now, sitting in this 21st century? What is the importance of writing? To understand archaeology and the evolution of human beings. How many people lived? And when did the beginning of man take place? Especially in forest, in caves, in temporary shelter, rock shelter. How did villages and cities evolve? It's a long story. And it went through a lot of development process, lot of struggle and lot of innovations, which took place at least 5,000 years before the establishment of the first cities. Establishing a city was not very easy in those days, and people used to travel from one place to another. That also you must be really aware of. How did all this happen? These are some of the questions that should be there in your mind before we start reading this chapter. And as I told you in the beginning, this is a very interesting chapter to sit and read now in this current situation. One of the most important changes was found when human beings started shifting from the status of being nomadic to settled agriculture. When you read the history parts in your class 9 and 10 chapters, we can see that there were a lot of people who were traveling from one place to another. Nobody was settled in one particular country, right? When the revolution and all that took place. But when gradually when there was a shift from the nomadic phase of human life to settled agriculture, especially this began 10,000 years ago, there was a lot of change. Lot of influences took place, because when human beings travel from one place to another, it is not easy for them to reconstruct or have a life of their own. It keeps on changing depending upon the place, right? So now adoption of agriculture played a very important role. And why do I say that agriculture is playing a very important role? Because people started settling and people also started cultivating. When people settled, they started planting things. They started depending on plant as a source of food. And they slowly started learning how to grow things. Because when they were traveling as nomads, they had to pluck the berries. You can even imagine they used to hunt animals. And when the food was over in a particular place, they will go and settle in some other place. And then they depend on the berries, the fruits and everything which was there. But when they started settling in a particular place, they understood that it was possible for them to grow food. They learned what to plant in a different place, in a particular place, because everywhere you will not have all the plants grown. It is not possible to grow all the variety of plants in a particular soil, right? So they understood the change of season, the style of the soil, the texture of the soil, the texture of the land, topography, all these things. You can see all the pictures here. So from this they learned to grow plants. And in West Asia, that is in the beginning of the civilization or human race, wheat, barley, peas. It is a very important point. Initial food, wheat, barley, peas and various kinds of pulses were grown. In East and Southeast Asia, the crops that grew easily were millet and rice. So these were very easy to be grown without much problems. And millet was grown in immense in Africa. We saw that the beginning of human race took place in Africa. How did that happen? That also we have got evidence in this chapter. At this particular time, people also learned how to domesticate or look after animals, because getting milk, getting meat and all these things would be easier when you have a livestock of your own. To look after animals such as sheep, goat, cattle, pig, donkey. Plant fibers such as cotton, flax, animal fiber such as wool were now woven into clothes. So when there is a settled life, all these things can be produced. That is the first step towards human development. Growing, settling in a particular place when the change took place from nomadic life to agricultural settlers. This point is very important. And about 5,000 years ago, domesticated animals such as cattle and donkeys were harnessed to plows and carts. So this harnessing or plowing and carting, everything took place even 5,000 years ago. That was the first invention or discovery of human beings. And so many changes took place as a result of this. As I told you earlier, when people started growing crops, they had to stay in the same place till the crops ripened and then they enjoy it. So what happened as a result of that? Settled life became more common. They may ask you, when did human beings start settling in a particular place? So all these points are very important to help you with the answer. People became more permanent structures, which meant that temporary residence or temporary movement, temporary settlement, all these things were taken away and they started settling in a place permanently, like how we do today. And they started making communities. Yes, as communities, they produced earthen pots, like how we have now. They had occupation as a collective procedure. They used to sit together and they used to make pots. And these pots were used to store the grain, because now they started cultivating millets, rice and all that, so where to store it? For that they needed something to store, and they made all these things. So to store the grain, it is a cyclic process where when they discovered one thing, they had to do the other thing. For example, when they grew crops, they had to store it somewhere. So then it led to the discovery of the earthen pots. Then to get meat or to get milk, they had to keep the animals to themselves. So it was a cyclic process which just took place, just like that. Okay. So they used earthen pots to store grains, other produce and all these things. And lot of attention was given to processing foods to make them tasty and digestible. We know that early man always had raw meat and raw food. But slowly they started discovering lot of procedures and process to make it really tasty and digestible. So always that hunger and taste buds and everything was working for the human beings from the beginning of time itself. So there is an old story which says that when human beings were having raw flesh, raw meat and all these things, one day suddenly they used to sit together campfire. I hope you know what is the meaning of a campfire. And suddenly a small child dropped a piece of meat which was given to him into the fire, and everybody started scolding him. And quickly they took that piece of meat out, thinking that it's spoiled. After it cooled down, they had this meat. It was so tasty, and that is how cooking came to be known. So this is a kind of incidental story which I read in one of the books. We don't know whether it's right, but this is how incidental discovery take place. It's through coincidence. It is through coincidence and accidental process that people discover a lot of things. Okay, so through coincidence, human beings really learned to make use of many things. Now, how did stone tools come about? Some tools and equipment were now smoothened and polished. Initially, they did not know how to smoothen and polish by elaborate process of grinding and all that. Because when they started making all these food, tasty, digestible and all that, they wanted to have mortars and pestles. This is mortar and pestle which you can find everywhere. Even now as Indians, we make use of it for processing and grinding. Earlier, they never made use of all these things. So to make food tasty, to make things really better, they started using all these equipments, stone axes, horse, and that was used to clear the land, because maybe they started using their hands and legs and all these things to move the land. But slowly when they started cultivating, they understood that they needed equipment. So that is how the stone, axes, horse and all these things were used for digging the earth to sow seeds. I told you about the accidental discovery. Yes, that is what it means. In some areas, people also accidentally started tapping ores of metal such as copper and tin. These were the first metals which were dug from the earth. Copper ores were collected and used for their distinctive bluish green color. It was so attractive, that is why they dug it out. Because initially people, when they start digging, they will find all these things. Yes, and they will dig it out. And that was used for jewelry, for decorating. So you should understand that from the beginning itself, human beings were interested in interior decoration and all these accessories. And lot of growing familiarity was there with other kinds of produce from distant lands and seas. So people started importing things, like people started coming from other places and they saw all these things and they also wanted such kind of things to be produced. And this included wood, stones, precious stones, semi-precious stones. They did not, of course, know that these were semi-precious stones and things like that. But slowly they discovered the importance of all these stones, especially metals, shell, volcanic lava, obsidian, hardened stones and all that. And clearly people were going from place to place carrying goods and idea with them. So ideas developed as they started using these things. Suppose man never used it, suppose man never discovered all these things, the ideas will not grow. Only when you start doing something, creativity will progress or ideas will develop. If you sit idle without doing anything, then nothing will progress. So that is the importance of this particular point.